So in the first part of the lecture tonight, I want to conclude our discussion of the Peloponnesian War and hence of Athens's 5th century empire. And I want to do so by asking some questions about how and why Athens lost the war. And then after that, I'll kind of move on to give a brief treatment of Greek history after the war, before the accession of Philip II of Macedon in the year 359. And then that period of time, from 404 to 359, is a complicated one, and we're not going to get too bogged down in it, but I will kind of give an overview, because then the next and last part of our course together will be about Philip and, of course, his son Alexander. So just to begin, at the start of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC, Athens was the odds-on favorite to win, given its resources, especially its fleet and its treasury. And so the question really is, how and why did the Athenians lose? Because they certainly shouldn't have in many ways. And these two questions don't necessarily add up to the same thing. The first question, the how question, of course, is easier to answer. The Athenians basically suffered many more reversals than triumphs during the war. They exhausted their resources, financial and manpower. The Persians allied with the Spartans against them, and then the Athenians basically lost everything in that final battle of Aegispotami in the year 405, as we talked about last lecture. All of these things and more combined to create this failure of their military effort. But did all of these events combine to bring Athens down? Was Athens's defeat the result of a cumulative effect of all of these reversals and losses, or was there something else at work, some other maybe more singular underlying cause? And that involves answering the second, or how, part of the question. Now, I admit that enough people agree with the earlier reasons that I gave for why Athens lost the war. And by extension, then, there is the implication that there was no single underlying cause. It might seem straightforward enough to simply chart the events, some major, some minor, that led to Athens's loss in the war. But appearance is not always reality. And as you know by now, I like to look for things that are slightly off the beaten path, about which we can have our own opinions. And I've certainly got an idea about why Athens lost the war. But let's chart the major versus the minor events first, because you might think this is the reason, the kind of accumulative nature of these various events, and that's fine. For example, the Great Plague, right? That plague, starting in the second year, really, of the war, robbed Athens of about 25% of its population, and it ultimately would take off Pericles. And the city took some 15 years to recover in terms of its fighting strength. And we have this throwaway comment that we talked about last time from Nicias in his speech in 416 on the eve of the Sicilian Expedition, about how it's only now, at that point in 416, that the Athenians are recovering from the plague. So the plague was a terrible disaster at the time, but the Athenians did recover from it, even if it did take them some 15 years to do so, to rebuild their manpower to the level it was beforehand. And in fact, in 428, only a year after the plague ended, we know that the Athenians sent a fleet to Mytilene on the island of Lesbos and besieged the place well into the following year. And what's more, the Athenians went on to fight the Spartans for another 2 decades after the plague had passed. So in the overall picture, then, of why Athens lost the war, we could argue that the plague was really nothing more than a minor event. It was terrible, to be sure, at the time, but in the long term, it didn't prove to be decisive. Well, what about the Sicilian Expedition? The Sicilian Expedition was a huge disaster for Athens, and it brought the city to its knees again, just as the plague had done. But yet again, the Athenians were able to recover from the disaster that was Sicily, and they fought on for another half a dozen years or so against the Spartans. The losses, though, in Sicily and the measures that the Athenians were forced to take would put the Sicilian expedition into the major box, I think, of reasons why Athens lost the war. And what is more, Thucydides attaches a lot more importance to the Sicilian expedition. He says it's one of the reasons, if not a major reason why Athens lost the war. Since he lived through this period, he ought to know, of course, and the fact that he attaches more importance to Sicily than the plague should tell us a lot, I think, and we should go along with him, I think. But in the end, everything did hinge on that one last battle at Aegospotami, the battle that I call the battle that never was. When the Athenians lost at Aegospotami, they did indeed lose the war. So we can say that Aegospotami must have been a major event, because after that it was all over. The Athenians had nothing to fall back on, and after being besieged by the Spartans, they surrendered. But what about the alliance between Sparta and Persia, the one that had been brokered by Alcibiades? We might argue that that alliance spelled Athens' doom, perhaps more than anything else, given the Persians' vast resources and naval expertise. Well, what about when the Spartans finally got their own navy together, and they appointed admirals of the caliber of Gylippus and Lysander to be in charge of it? Think also, if you will, of the role of individuals generally in the war, as opposed to events. In the Persian wars, we saw that individuals were instrumental in defeating the Persians. So does the same apply to the Peloponnesian War? If there had been no Themistocles, that is, the Persian wars might have turned out very differently. So what about major individuals in the Peloponnesian War? Figures like Lysander, Brasidas, Cleon, Nicias, and Demosthenes. To me, these men play ephemeral roles. They come and go at various points in the war, but what they do doesn't really affect what happens after their departure, at least not in any major way. But then think of someone like Alcibiades. Alcibiades really does dominate events from the very first time we meet him as strategos in 420 BC, down to his advice to the Athenians at Aegospotami in 405. And of course, his advice was, don't try to leave your fleet here, move it somewhere else. There's no question that Alcibiades was correct in that. And that, in general, his activities affected the progress of the war for many, many years, and therefore affected events in general. Without him, one could argue that there wouldn't have been the oligarchy of 411, definitely. So in fact, we could draw up a pretty comprehensive list of events and a list of people that cost Athens the war. And in the process of doing this list, we would probably go insane as we tried to argue which events or personages are minor and which ones are major. The plague would be a perfect example. Just a few minutes ago, I said that you could argue it was a minor event because the Athenians recovered from it. But then again, if there hadn't been a plague, we could argue that Pericles wouldn't have died, or at least not died when he did. We could argue that the Athenians would have not overstretched their resources because that was part of his, one of the prongs of his strategy. We could argue that there would have been no ill-fated expedition to Sicily because remember, he had told them, the Athenians, not to try to extend their empire during the war, another one of his prongs. And perhaps there would have been no Spartan-Persian alliance because he could have gotten involved and stifled that, and therefore there would have been no Aegospotami. So arguably then, the plague could be seen as a major event because it carried away the seemingly omnipotent Pericles. Remember what Thucydides had to say about Pericles in Book 2, Chapter 65 of his work. Thucydides says that in what was nominally a democracy, power was in the hands of a single man, Pericles. And I've argued in the past that Pericles engineered the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. So if he were to have remained on the scene for a few more years at least, how different the Peloponnesian War might have been. Well, perhaps this sort of thinking doesn't really come close anyway to answering the question as to why Athens lost the war. And this gets me back to my belief in a single cause that runs through all the minor ones, and all the major ones for that matter too. And I'm going to stick to, I'm going to pick up where Thucydides makes this comment, Book 2, Chapter 65, that the poor leadership after Pericles' death caused Athens' defeat. That is, after Pericles' death, the demagogues that followed him got Athens involved in Sicily, and through their disastrous leadership cost Athens the war. Thucydides basically is saying this in part because he wants to show how great a leader Pericles was, of course. Thucydides wants to contrast Pericles with the wretches that were the demagogues that followed him, especially Cleon, whom Thucydides hated. And Thucydides wants to show how great Pericles' strategy was, and then look what happened to it when these demagogues diverted from it. We come away with feeling nothing but contempt for the leadership after Pericles. And that's, of course, what Thucydides wants us to think. In reality, though, Pericles' three-pronged strategy could not have won a war that lasted as long as the Peloponnesian War ultimately did. Pericles' strategy would have to have been adapted, altered in some way, especially once Persia was on the scene. And Thucydides had to know this well. Let's not forget that Thucydides was himself a strategos. He had military knowledge. He could appreciate Pericles' strategy, but as we talked about earlier on, that strategy could only have worked if the war was short in terms of its duration, a short-term war. Can one really imagine keeping the entire population of Attica within the walls of Athens year after year after year for 27 years, which is what the war stretched onto? That was only one prong of the strategy. But while I personally don't think that Thucydides hits the nail on the head when he talks about the leadership of Athens as the factor that cost Athens the war, I would argue that it's the nature of Athens's political system, the democracy, and the role of the people in it that ultimately was the underlying factor that cost Athens the war. That is, the constant factor that runs throughout Athenian history, not just the war, but all throughout Athenian history, it is the constant that runs throughout the major and minor events, is its democracy, and how this ultimately leads to Athens's downfall. In some respects, Thucydides gets it right, because I've long thought that while his history of the war has several messages embedded in it, and of course it does, and these messages are often brought out in the speeches he concocts, the underlying message, the main one, the one message, if you like, that comes out time and time again in Thucydides, is the danger of widespread political power. Okay, that is perhaps not an attractive message to us because we are so used to thinking of democracy as an unalloyed good. But widespread political power, that is political power in the hands of the masses, direct democracy, which is what Athens has. This, I think, is what he's trying to tell us, that we can see it, that this ultimately is a negative thing. And we see it in his scornful references to the demos, that is the technical term for the Athenian citizenry of Athens, as nothing more than a mob, basically, and how he says that mobs are emotional and not good things. And of course, we who are living through the fall of our own republic in the last year or so, we've seen a lot of mobs on both sides of the political spectrum, and I think we can agree with that, can't we? That mobs are not a good thing. Mobs are emotional, and he even says towards the end of his work, this is in book 8, chapter 97, if you want to get into the look at the primary source yourself, after the restoration of the moderate democracy in 411/410, that is after the oligarchy that took over briefly, Athens had the best constitution in his opinion. And why? Because, he puts it, there was a moderate blending of the few and the many. And he uses this important word, homonoia, or ammonia, it would be the modern way to pronounce that. The central square in Athens, if you go to the central square of Athens where the tomb of the unknown soldier is called Ammonia Square, or homonoia square. This concept of concord, that's basically what that means, concord. This moderate blending of the few and the many. It was a potent word in the Athenian political vocabulary. And it wasn't in the direct democracy. That's the whole point of what Thucydides says, that for the first time, there's a kind of check or limitation of the power of the people. It wasn't a direct democracy anymore, because direct democracy had been what had brought Athens to its knees. Now, I've had many clashes with people over the years on this aspect of Thucydides, about what his main message is and so on. Nothing upsets somebody greater who thinks that he or she knows what Thucydides is all about if you argue against a person like that. It's kind of good if you feel like trolling them, but I'll stop on this line right now, because I'm diverting from what I really want to get at right now, and that is the reason why Athens lost the war. Basically, a democracy, a direct democracy now is what I'm talking about, the kind that Athens had, cannot run a war. It couldn't back then, and it couldn't now either. The ease by which individual speakers in the assembly of Athens could exploit their rhetorical skills to sway the people in that assembly. And we can think, for example, of this in Alcibiades, when he talked about Sicily, or the trial of the Arginusi generals. This all shows how fickle the people were. And that is hardly a good thing for supporting a consistent or informed war policy. Some of these leaders, these demagogues, operated in the city's best interests. I've told you that I think Cleon did, for example. I think he really did benefit the city. And I think he was right to block the Spartan peace proposals of 425. And I think he was right to try to win Amphipolis back. However, other demagogues didn't operate in the best interest of Athens. They didn't do so either for their own corrupt reasons or because they misjudged the situation. So Alcibiades should not have advocated the Sicilian campaign, for instance. He did so because he saw that as a means to an end, and the end was his own military reputation. In 406 BC, after the Battle of Arginusi, Cleophon, one of the demagogues, should have imposed terms on the Spartans, but he did not. And so it's not surprising that the war brought with it two periods of oligarchy, in 411 and then in 404 to 403, the rule of the 30, which showed the downsides of coupling an unstable domestic life with a disastrous foreign policy. That these conditions existed in Athens was not due to the twists and turns of the war, but rather to the radical democracy. At no time was an elected and exclusive committee created with military expertise to plan strategy to run the war, as would be the case today, or rather as it's supposed to be the case today. Instead of the Athenians in the assembly, who were largely inexpert, ran the war, or they tried to run it. Perhaps then the explanation for why Athens lost the war lies not in Sparta winning the final battle, but with the Athenians themselves. Athens lost the war before it began. The inexpertise of the assembly was swayed by rhetoric and emotion rather than by reason, and as such, these people became putty in the hands of skillful speakers, many of whom didn't have the necessary military skills themselves, and yet they were advising on military matters. This all flies in the face of why the office of strategos was introduced, doesn't it? And so I would say Athens lost the Peloponnesian War the day it began. But to make matters worse, the Athenians never learned from their mistakes, as their military exploits and their own brand of imperialism in the 4th century will prove, and that is now a segue into the second part of this initial portion of our lecture tonight. I'm going to give you now just a very brief survey of Greek history from the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC to 362 or so, a period that is commonly called the period of the hegemonies, or the age of the hegemonies, and we'll soon see why that is. At the end of the Peloponnesian War, Sparta became the hegemon of the Greeks, and the period from 404 to 371 BC is known as the Spartan hegemony. The Spartans proved to be unpopular leaders. The Spartans proved to be unpopular leaders because they had little or no regard for their allies. And after their defeat of the Athenians at Aegospotami, Lysander had established a number of oligarchies in states that were former Athenian allies. So it wasn't just Athens. These regimes the Spartans called decharchies, or boards of 10, and they came to be hated as much as the Athenian clerics were hated in the days of the Athenian Empire. The Spartans might well say, Hippocrates doesn't care, remember that one? But whether they cared or not, in 395, a decade or so after the Peloponnesian War came to an end, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos all banded together in what is commonly called the Quadruple Alliance, and they went to war against Sparta. They had had enough. Modern historians call this the Corinthian War, and it lasted until 387 BC. The fighting was severe, and it took place on the Isthmus, that is this little thin strip of land connecting the Peloponnesus to mainland Greece, and as far afield also as Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. In the early days of this Corinthian War, Lysander himself was killed. A further blow to Sparta was also the defeat of its navy at Cnidus, which is in the southwest of Asia Minor, and the Spartan fleet there was defeated by Conon, no less, one of those demagogues from Athens. This was the same Conon who had fled to Cyprus, you remember, after Agaspotami, and it would seem by now he was hoping that his countrymen would be letting bygones be bygones, especially if he could boast a Spartan defeat. And it is significant that Conon received help from the Persian satrap, since the Spartan king Agesilaus, and Agesilaus is really one of the most colorful characters of this hegemony period. I could talk about him if I have time later on. He was involved in Asia, and his exploits there were annoying Artaxerxes, the great king. And therefore, as a result, Conon was forgiven. He was allowed to return to Athens, and he helped to rebuild the long walls and refortify the Piraeus, that is the port city of Athens. So the Athenians were on the move again. A surprising defeat for the Spartan army came in the year 390 at the hands of the Athenian general Iphicrates, which caused the Spartans to appeal to the great king for help, and this was granted. As a result, the Corinthian War ended in 387 BC, and it ended on the great king's terms. The resulting treaty, in fact, was known as the King's Peace, and it restored the status quo as of 404 BC, as far as Sparta's hegemonic power was concerned. In return for Persian help, the Spartans turned their backs on the Greeks of Asia Minor, whom they had been supporting in clashes with the king of Persia, the great king. They had basically betrayed the Greeks of Asia Minor, therefore, in return for the king of Persia's reestablishing of the Spartan hegemony of Greece. So these Greeks of Asia Minor were left to fend for themselves, left in the lurch, and they remained subject to the Persian king until the time of Alexander the Great. That the Spartans had done this didn't sit well with the other Greeks, nor did the fact that for the first time a Persian king, not a Greek, but a Persian king had settled affairs in Greece. The Greeks didn't like that. And the Spartans had kind of been instrumental in making that happen too. Well, the Spartans now became involved in Boeotian affairs, where they saw Thebes' power as a serious source for concern. In 382 BC, the Spartans seized the Cadmea, which is basically like the Acropolis of Thebes. And this action, completely illegal, caused outrage among the other Greeks. The Spartan commander who had been behind the attack on Thebes was put on trial. So it appeared as if Sparta seemed to be bowing to Greek pressure for the Spartan seizure of the Cadmea. But a certain Spartan commander who was leading this force was let off only with a small fine, and Sparta retained its control of Thebes. They kept a Spartan garrison there too, in fact, a humiliation. And by the year 378, the Thebans who had fled when Sparta seized the Cadmea returned, this time with Athenian troops, and these exiles expelled the Spartan garrison from Thebes. The Athenian support for the Thebans probably led to an unsuccessful attempt on the part of Sparta to seize the Piraeus. But as I said, that didn't work. So what we have by the year 378, and this is now the big year, okay? I'm leading up to this major year. The year 378 then is that there are three big powers in Greece, Sparta, Athens, and Thebes, and they're all at loggerheads with each other. And against this scenario, we start to see the Athenians increasing their influence again. They had been down and out since the year 404, since their defeat at the hands of Sparta at the end of the Peloponnesian War. And it is because of this attempt by the Spartans on the Piraeus that probably led the Athenians to do something that had been unthinkable in 404 at the end of the Peloponnesian War. They created a new league. The phoenix arises from the ashes. And this new league was called the very uncreatively named Second Athenian Naval Confederacy. Remember, the original Delian League had been called the Athenian Naval Confederacy. Now this is the second one. It would last from 378 to 338 BC, when it was disbanded by Philip II of Macedon, following the Battle of Chaeronea, which we're going to learn all about later on, after which Philip had asserted Macedonian hegemony over Greece. So the Delian League, Athens' 5th century empire, had been anti-Persian, and this Second Athenian Naval Confederacy was anti-Spartan. So the days of the Spartan hegemony started to be numbered. We can't help but admire, though, the Athenians for their resilience. Within 30 years of their defeat in the Peloponnesian War and the humiliating terms that the Spartans had imposed upon them, the Athenians had founded another league. And this one would also turn into an empire. Indeed, it would become Athens' 4th century empire. The charter for this Second Athenian Naval Confederacy survives today. We have it in a fragmented form. It is called the Decree of Aristotle'S, and it dates from 377 BC. It's one of the most important and one of the most fascinating documents of the 4th century that has survived. Among its various clauses, it is interesting to see that in an effort to attract allies to their league, the Athenians swore they wouldn't do a number of things, such as installing garrisons, governors, or kleroukes in allied towns. They wouldn't levy a tribute either. So clearly, these sorts of things were among the more well-known, hated features of the 5th century empire. Perhaps otherwise, the Athenians wouldn't have had to swear that they wouldn't resort to these practices if they were not known to be so hated, but they were. And so in all, about 60 or 70 Greek states joined the Athenian Confederacy. Many of them had been members of the 5th century Delian League. However, it was not the Athenians who brought the Spartan hegemony to an end. It was the Thebans. Declining relations between Sparta and Thebes led to the Spartans invading Boeotia with a Peloponnesian force of some 9,000 men in the year 371 BC. And of these, only 700 were actual Spartans. The small number was probably the product of that same problem we've been talking about since lecture 5, the decline in manpower. The Thebans mobilized an army of about 6,000 men under the generals Pelopidas and Epaminondas, wonderful names. The two sides, Sparta and Thebes, met at Leuctra, and the Thebans, thanks to the fighting ability of the famous Sacred Band, inflicted a decisive defeat on the Spartans. Something like 400 of the 700 Spartans were killed, and that included their king, Cleombrotus, who was leading the Spartan contingent. The Spartans had recovered from defeat before, we've seen that, but they weren't going to recover this time, because the Thebans went on to do something that no one had ever done before. The Thebans entered the Peloponnesus. They devastated the lands of Laconia, and then they marched into Messenia, home of the Helots. Once in Messenia, they liberated the Helots, they set them free, and they restored their former capital of Messina, which was in Mount Ithome. Given the importance of the Helots to the Spartans' economic survival, this Theban action immediately ended Sparta's influence in central Greek affairs ever afterwards. It reduced Sparta to a shadow of its former self. One scholar says that Sparta from now on became nothing more than a local wrangler in Peloponnesian politics. And this would persist. This would persist until the Roman occupation, where basically Sparta became something like a museum, where Romans, having read all of these works about the Persian wars and learning all about their ways, would go and visit Augustus. The emperor went and visited to go and see the Spartans, kind of like, almost like a Williamsburg, like, that's what it's called, right? The one in Virginia. Not Williamsburg, Brooklyn, but the one in Virginia, where you can go and like see people dress up like they did in colonial days and like use blacksmith tools or whatever. It's something like that. But the point, though, is that after the Battle of Leuctra, after the Battle of 371, when Thebes defeated Sparta, the Spartan hegemony was over, okay? And from 371 to 362, the Thebans were the dominant force on the Greek mainland. But their supremacy was going to be short-lived because in 362, the pendulum swung back in Athens' favor. Pelopidas, that is the Theban commander, was killed during an incursion into Thessaly, which is in northern Greece, kind of like up here, basically. And Epaminondas found himself faced with problems in the Peloponnesus, because there, a number of states, including Sparta, had joined together against Thebes and even enlisted the aid of Athens. So talk about the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Remember, the Athenians had headed a confederacy that was anti-Spartan, and this was proclaimed at the very start of the charter. But now Athens and Sparta had joined forces together against Thebes. So you can see, I mean, that is a theme that really has run throughout our entire course, that these city-states just could not get along. Built into the very nature of the polis system is this, xenophobia and this distrust, this suspicion, of one another, and this tremendous sense of one's autonomia, this one's of autonomy and of liberty, and it would produce just basically an endless cycle of wars. In 362 BC, Epaminondas marched into the Peloponnesus, and he was intent on attacking Sparta. And he did battle with his coalition army at Mantinea, famous battle there. And although the Thebans were victorious, Epaminondas was killed. There was no one to take over from him back in Thebes, and so the Theban ascendancy in Greece came to an end. And that left Athens to reassert its dominant position in Greek affairs yet again, thanks to its hegemony of its naval confederacy. And although the Athenians turned their confederacy into a 4th century empire, in the process, they disregarded the autonomy of their allies, and they broke their oaths by imposing kleroukies and a tribute that they called contributions. Nice little bit of euphemism there. Any thought that they would single-handedly call the shots in Greece were dashed, though, within a couple of decades, when Philip II of Macedon came to power. And we will learn all about that starting in our next class. Hopefully that is the book that you've started reading as well. You've already become familiar with him. So the year 362 is the year that Xenophon's account, the Hellenica, his account of Greek history, ends. Coincidentally, as this new power was rising in the north, and that is Macedon. And it is in the 4th century then, after the Athenians bounced back from their defeat in the Peloponnesian War, that their judicial system came to maturity. And it is from this period now, the 4th century, not so much from the 5th century, that in the 4th century, when their judicial system came to maturity, that the bulk of our extant forensic speeches come. We have traced the development of law to the time of Ephialtes in previous lectures, and then we had to adjourn court for a while we discussed aspects of Athenian imperialism. And so what I'd like to do now for the rest of tonight, okay, we have a good deal more time, is to discuss aspects of Athenian imperialism, okay? So if you're following along with the notes, this would now be on page 3. And let us turn to that. The legal code of Athens was shaped to protect the family and the society. This is a feature of Athenian law that is quite distinct. The law comes out of this desire to shape and protect the family and therefore the society. And in fact, as a prelude to our discussion of law, I want to take a look at a broad look at the family and its role in the state during the period that we've just covered and in the next period that is to come. Because this is really important. We can't really understand Athenian law without understanding the Athenian family and how it is structured and how it is in some ways very different than ours, of course, in many ways similar. Well, the family is an integral part of every society as a whole, and the Greek society would be no different. But as I say, it is in protecting the family that the legal code was shaped, something that we'll discuss tonight. But right now, I want to outline just the relationship of the family to the polis and the role of the family in civic life, because there are some important differences between then and now. And I also want to discuss the family unit, the members of it, what each was expected to do, and what society's attitudes were to each member, and so on. Finally, on the society level, I want to give some examples of the downsides and of of the interrelationship between society and family. And these examples, I believe, will put a very different perspective on things. All too often, the view of Athens, indeed of Greece, that we're presented with in documentaries and and so on the Greek genius or some such or other thing, glossy picture books, is how grand the place was. Okay, and we come away with an appreciative glow, with warm fuzzies, and of course that's very important. There's nothing like the Greek civilization in all of human history, and so we have to have that love and that appreciation. But there, of course, were negatives, and we cannot be blind to them. And as I've always said, we cannot simply worship the ancient Greeks and think of them as being unflawed with nothing left to improve upon. And so I'm going to give you some insights and let you make up your own mind about those kind of more negative sides too, as we'll see tonight. So the Greek word for family or family unit is oikos, like the yogurt. Aristotle, in his Politics, emphasized that the oikos was such an integral part of the polis that, to put it more crudely, you couldn't have a polis without oikoi. Oikoi being the plural, of course, of oikos. The family, or the oikos, was far more bound up with the actual well-being and continuation of the state than it is today. And correspondingly so, also was the dependence of the state on the oikoi. There were also similarities in running the two entities, the oikos and the polis. Aristotle tells us in the Politics, when he writes, "Some thinkers believe that running a household and controlling slaves and being a politician and being a king are all the same," end quote. Only the scale then, in his view, would be different between polis and oikos. Well, Aristotle defined the oikoi, or the oikos, as consisting of a husband, a wife, legitimate children, and slaves. Okay, so I'll just say those again: husband, wife, legitimate children, and slaves. Those make up the oikos for Aristotle. And I would just like to consider each one of those family members in turn. The head of the household was known as the kurios, which of course in modern Greek and church Greek is pronounced Kyrios. This is as in Kyrie eleison, the Lord have mercy. So the word kurios in ancient Greek meant Lord, or absolute authority. Dominus would be the Latin way for that, and once we get the word dominate and so on. He had the absolute authority inside of the oikos. The kurios had three distinct duties. He had to provide the oikos with the means of sustenance. In other words, he was the breadwinner. He had to put food on the table. He also had the absolute duty to protect the oikos in times of war. And lastly, he had to ensure the household standing in the eyes of the gods. This meant that the position of his wife and children had to be clearly marked out in the household, and that both the wife and children were subordinate to him. Okay, the husband, then, the kurios, was the most overtly powerful member in the oikos, and his duty as a citizen was to provide for it and to take part in political life. Now, women, the wife in the family, well, actually, we'll come back to them in a moment. The line of descent in the oikos passed from father to son. In other words, it was a patrilineal descent. This seems the norm throughout the Greek world, and in fact, on the mainland, at least, it goes back to the Bronze Age, the Mycenaean period. There were exceptions to this rule. In Sparta, as we've already mentioned before, women could inherit land, and they could own land in their own names. And on the island of Crete, interestingly enough, it appears that the line was matrilineal, that is, through the mother. But these were the exceptions. They were few and far between, and they certainly didn't apply to Athens. When there was not a son to inherit the oikos, the father could adopt one. Or, if he had a daughter, his daughter could inherit the oikos in order to retain the family property, but she would be expected to marry her nearest male relative, usually her uncle, and so continue the oikos line through her new husband. Marriages were arranged, often for economic reasons. The grooms might see their brides in advance of the wedding. They probably did. But girls had no say at all in the matter. More than that, they often didn't see their husbands until the day of their wedding. So they had no idea what he was like, what his tastes were like, what his favorite color was, whether he snored or anything like that. Athenian girls were married very young, usually around the age of 12 or 13. But the groom was normally in his 30s. And that strikes us as repulsive, but it was actually not uncommon in the ancient world at all. This was largely because the rates of women dying in childbirth were just so horribly high that it was expected that a husband might have to remarry somebody at a later point, that basically you know, a girl could marry as soon as she was physically capable of having children, and you know, the younger would be kind of considered to be more healthy, and you know, the greater chance of, as I said, if something were to go wrong and the girl did die, the husband would be much older anyway. So when the girl married, the Athenian girl passed from the authority of her father to that of her husband, who was then responsible for completing her education as far as the household went. We actually have a treatise by Xenophon called the Oikonomicos, which gives us our word economics, the nomos of the oikos, the law of the household. And in this treatise, a husband called Iskomikos is talking to Socrates, the famous Socrates, about the ideal wife. And along the way, Isomachus tells us that when he married, he had to educate his wife in almost everything, including how to arrange storage jars in the family home. Now, I would just add one thing. This, if you have listened to everything I've just said about the traditions of marriage, the fact that if a husband died and there was no one for the if a father died and there was nobody there for no other sons to inherit the oikos, the girl could inherit it, but then she would have to marry her closest male relative, usually an uncle, and then go and live with him, usually in some place far away from where the mother had been living, in her home, the home that the only home she had known her whole life. There is a fascinating interpretation of the myth of Demeter and Persephone that goes along those lines. I'm sure you're all familiar with. I know you are because of your book reports, where you had to read about this myth. But so you know that Demeter, Mother Nature, has a daughter and named Persephone, and she is then the daughter Persephone is abducted by her own uncle, who is Hades, who brings her to a faraway place that is Hades, the place of Hades, and then forces her basically to be married. And now you can see there's something kind of reflective there of the Athenian practice of marriage, right? That a girl could be forced into marriage to her uncle, that she would have to leave her home and go far away, and that the mother would be very sad, and kind of they might work out some kind of like arrangement. It all actually seems in some ways reflective. I don't want to reduce the myth just to that, because there's so many, it works on so many other levels too, but I just want to put that out there. It's a fascinating interpretation. Now, I did mention the idea of the extreme youth of the girl, you know, being 12 or 13 when she gets married. The other, you know, the idea of childbirth and stuff like that. But the real reason for the extreme youth of the bride was bound up with her being a virgin, because only legitimate children from a marriage could inherit the oikos. In fact, the Athenians were virtually paranoid about legitimacy. It was an obsession of theirs, and the definition of what comprised a legitimate Athenian citizen came finally in the year 451 BC, when Pericles introduced his citizenship law, which stated that both parents had to be citizens before offspring of that marriage was deemed legitimate. Okay, so I'll just say it again. The law stipulated that both parents had to be citizens before offspring of that marriage were deemed legitimate. It is this concern about legitimacy that is at the heart of the Athenian law of adultery. In particular, why that law had such strict and harsh penalties. Moreover, adultery was a public offense, and that strikes us as very odd. Adultery, public? Today, for example, if a couple goes through a divorce, only their own family is affected. They divide up their property into whatever proportion they and the divorce lawyers agree upon. Unless there is a prenup, you know, it gets divvied up. If children are involved and there's a custody battle, the parties might go before family court, and the matter essentially is a civil or private one, certainly not a public one affecting the state. But back in ancient Greece, that was not the case. While divorce was an option for women, we seldom hear of women divorcing their husbands. And we'll talk about instances of when a husband divorced his wife in a moment. But the point I'm trying to stress, though, is that the whole law and all the stuff about inheritance and citizenship rights of who was legitimate and who it all comes from this preoccupation with the family, and it all grows out of the family. Okay, that's where Athenian law really comes from. The Oikos is the foundation stone of the polis. It was bound up with the very well-being of the polis. And that meant that anything that comprised the continuation of the polis, that means that anything that compromised the continuation of the oikos affected the community as the whole, the polis. What affected the oikos more than anything else was if there were doubt cast upon the legitimacy of the children of a family, because illegitimate children could not inherit the oikos and therefore continue the family line. Who's to say then that the children of a wife who had an extramarital affair were all legitimate, right? There was no DNA test back in those days. And so the only way you knew that your children were really yours is if the mother were a virgin when she was married and she lived a life of, impeccable moral scrupulosity. That's why the Athenian law of adultery was so severe and a public one, because the whole community suffered. Adulterers could be fined or suffer torture, including having their their pubic hair plucked out, or even more horrible things that I'll refrain from talking about. Or if the husband returned home and caught his wife and lover in the act, he could actually kill the adulterer on the spot with total legal impunity, justified homicide. And I'll talk about this later on tonight. We'll be reading in the supplementary readings on the website. There is what we'll be reading next week is probably the most famous speech about this very subject by Lysias. As for the adulterous wife, she was automatically divorced, and she could never attend again certain state sacrifices or festivals. And this was a massive social stigma, far more so than today, because she would never marry again in Athens. Who would want to marry a woman who had voluntarily endangered the existence of her oikos, who didn't, respect her role in the oikos? If she happened to ignore this law, in other words, if she did still move around the city as a citizen woman, and if she did attend these sacrifices and festivals, then anyone who saw her could inflict any punishment on her short of death. However, if the husband didn't divorce his wife, he would lose his citizenship. So there was no chance whatsoever, like there is today, for a married couple, if one discovers the other had had an adulterous affair, there was no chance back in Athens, as there is today, for one person to forgive the other, and the couple continuing to stay married. The law simply forbade that in Athens. The voluntary nature of the wife's crime is perhaps the reason why the Athenians regarded rape as less of a crime than seduction. That is, kind of seducing a woman to have an extramarital affair. And the penalty imposed on rapists was simply a monetary fine. Towards rape, of course, we have the same definition as the Athenians had. When a woman is overtaken and has no power in the situation. And therefore, it is because of that, because of the idea that the woman is overpowered and has no volition in the situation, that the crime is considered to be less egregious than adultery, because in adultery, the woman has consented. And that is why the Athenians came down harder on the adulterous woman than on the woman who had been raped or on the rapist himself. Now, you're probably wondering what sort of restrictions were put on men, on the husband. And in a word, none. The husband, the kurios, was free to go around and have affairs with prostitutes and courtesans, just not someone else's wife. And if those women, that is the prostitutes or courtesans, have happened to have given birth, then their children would automatically be regarded as illegitimate. Okay, so if a citizen man had a child with a non-citizen woman, the children were illegitimate. They would have few social and judicial rights. The technical term for this was a nothos. This is the older meaning of the word bastard in English. Now, the society didn't preclude male citizens from any social group, upper or lower, from marrying non-citizen women or even prostitutes, but the marriage was not regarded as a proper or legal one, and the children from that marriage could not be Athenian citizens. So they could kind of keep up with them, kind of like a concubine or something like that, but not as an actual legal wife. The apparent male attitude towards women is neatly summed up in an extract from a forensic speech in which the speaker divides women into three categories. And I'll just quote this for you now. Living with a woman who is a man's wife means this: to have children by her and to introduce the sons to the members of the clan and of the deme, and to betroth the daughters to husbands as one's own. Prostitutes we keep for the sake of pleasure, courtesans for the daily care of our persons, but wives we keep to give us legitimate children and to be faithful guardians of our households, end quote. Okay, so that basically says it all. We know from court speeches, from forensic oratory, that the husband and wife lived apart in their house. There was special compartments, kind of wings of the house, where the wife lived upstairs and the husband lived downstairs. We also know that the door to the wife's quarters could be locked, and locked from the outside. This was not so much for her own protection, if the husband went out partying at nighttime or something like that, but it was to keep her locked in so that an adulterer couldn't come inside, or for that matter, that she couldn't go outside, and the husband would be ignorant of whatever she did. Perhaps it is no wonder then, given this attitude and the massive age difference that existed between husband and wife, that there would have been some opportunity for temptation to have an affair. Just think about this kind of, obviously the emotional connection there probably would have been very lacking. These are people who had not been, not fallen in love before they got married or something like that. They simply were kind of arranged to be married. There's a massive age difference, and then the woman is kind of kept under lock and key. They were unlikely, the husband and wife were unlikely to have had any mutual friends. They couldn't just go out with their married friends for drinks or something like that. Perhaps love might grow. But then again, Aristotle, who I think is reflective of the ethos of the time, has this to say in his Ethics, quote, "The love between a husband and his wife is the same as that which exists between the government and the governed." End quote. Okay, so there you have it. Marital bliss indeed. I've never actually, now that I think about it, I've never mentioned that quote to my own wife. I wonder how she would, wonder if she would appreciate that. Anyway, it is interesting that given this apparent male attitude towards women, that Athenians were quite happy that their patron deity, Athena, was female. It's kind of strange, isn't it? They also seem to have been quite happy that the priestess of the Oracle of Delphi, the Pythia, was a woman, or that the wife of the Archon Basileus had certain important religious duties. But if you notice, that was all religion, and so therefore it made it different. You see, it could be kind of thought of as being kind of a separate entity from day-to-day life in terms of those were distinct categories as opposed to the way that one governed one's household and stuff like that. So let's now talk about the children in the family. I've already sort of touched on the subject by talking about some of the things with both the girls getting married and also the sons inheriting the oikos. But let's go further with that. The children, the male children, were expected to grow up and inherit the oikos, while the female children would marry in their early teens, as I said, and they would move out of their home, oikos, into their new home. The boys would eat the normal staple food with meat from time to time, occasionally wine if the family could afford it. Girls, however, seldom ate meat, and they hardly ever drank wine with a meal. And even when they did drink wine, it would always be watered down. So there were these kind of sex differentiations, even when it came to food. There's probably an economic explanation for this. There wasn't enough meat to go around, that is, on the very few occasions that the family could afford to eat meat. And so the boys would have had the preference because of their role in the oikos. And therefore, it's easy to see, if you keep in mind the attraction of a tyrant like Pisistratus in the mid-6th century, who introduced and revamped festivals that provided the free meat, wine, and entertainment for ordinary people. No wonder everybody loved him. Okay, because you have to think the main staples in the there's something called, that sociologists refer to as the Mediterranean Triad. That is the three main foodstuffs that people ate in the ancient world in the Mediterranean were wheat, olive oil, and grapes. Okay, those are the three main things. Of course, you could supplement that with some protein. Mostly it would be either cheese or fish or something like that. Meat, as I said, very rarely. Until about the age of 7 or so, boys and girls were generally reared side by side. But after that age, they would separate, and in wealthier households, it would be the boys who received a more formal education. And Sparta, of course, we know the boys enter the agoge at age 7. And all of this did not preclude bonds of affection between parent and child. And we do have plenty of ancient evidence that showed children were loved and needed and cherished. For example, the poet Theognis of Megara, writing in the middle of the 6th century, has this to say, quote, "Happy is he that has dear children, whole-hooved horses, hunting dogs, and friends in foreign parts." Theognis goes on to say later on, quote, but he that does not love children and whole-hooved horses and dogs has never a happy heart," end quote. At the same time, archaeology has found that child burials were common, though whether these were the product of natural deaths or exposure, as we talked about in the case of Sparta, which was widespread everywhere in the ancient world, is hard to say. We know that the exposure of children was common practice in Sparta, as we've talked about, but in rural Attica, for instance, if a farmer's wife gave birth to yet another child, perhaps yet another daughter, and there wasn't enough food to go around, and given the cultural preference for males, well, the parents may have had no other option but to expose the baby. Of course, I say that no other option in quotation marks. They would have felt that they had, no other option but to leave the baby out to die. And this is, of course, rather similar in many ways to certain practices that are still found in different parts of the world, in China, for instance, or in rural India, when parents find that they're having a girl, especially with sonogram technology. It is not at all an uncommon thing, especially during when China was still having its one-child policy, which only ended very recently. It was very much a common practice to abort the girls, or just simply to kill them after birth. And in fact, in China, this has been going on for so many decades now that there's something like a 20% difference between males and females. That is, there's 20% more males than there are females. And that is a very, very large discrepancy. It may not sound like one, but it is. And it has produced all sorts of other social ills in Chinese society, with not enough females to marry. There is a large market for prostitution from the poorer countries of Southeast Asia, like Thailand and Cambodia and other places. So this was certainly, though, something that would have been common in the ancient Greek world as well. And in fact, an argument has been made by at least one scholar that in a society such as Greece, with its economic problems and its high death rates, parents maybe could not afford to become too attached to their children, perhaps because they might grow to love them so much, and then to see them die, that they couldn't afford that bond to develop. They were protecting themselves in some ways. One can perhaps see evidence of this interpretation. Of course, we can't really know if such a thing were true or not, but if you read in Plato's Republic, one of the characteristics he gives of the ideal state is for parents to kind of swap their children with other parents, so that every family is raising children that they know are not their own, but the children do not realize that their parents are not their own. And so for the reason that they will not become overly attached to them, Plato actually says that. So maybe there is that lurking in the background there. Well, the final member of the oikos, as Aristotle defines the oikos, was the slaves. Aristotle describes slaves as, quote, animate tools, which tells us, I think, in a nutshell, what the general attitude to slavery was. And slaves were frequently physically exploited. Slaves were non-Athenian citizens, of course. They were captured in warfare. There was no racial basis for slavery in Greece. They were captured in warfare either against foreign foes or more usually against other Greek polis. Slaves were used in economic sectors of society, such as mining, that is the more dangerous economic sectors, and of course, agriculture. Most households also had slaves in them. They were part of the oikos. Just like in Latin, one of the words for slave in Latin is famulus, which is directly related to the word familia, family. The line between the free and the unfree was harshly drawn. As I said, physical exploitation was common, but even in the case of the law courts, for a slave's testimony to be admissible in court, the slave had first to be tortured, regardless of his or her age. That seems absolutely outrageous. The idea, of course, was that a slave was naturally of a lower character and therefore would say anything. It could not be trusted, but only their words could only be verified if they had been tortured. So given all of that, it therefore seems incompatible to say that the slave was part of an oikos, part of the family. And yet we do have this attitude that is expressed in the sources that there wasn't any incompatibility here. Perhaps to the Athenians, the slave was not, as you know, of course, not on the same level as a family member in the blood sense of it. The slave's role in the oikos was merely economic. It was to help the oikos, run smoothly. But still, that did count for something in terms of they were a member of the household. The slave might do the shopping, he might do chores around the house, and although the mistress had the job of tending slaves that fell ill, this had nothing to do with the slave's actual welfare, but so that the slaves could get well again soon and get back on their feet and start working in the oikos again. So there is then another side to the coin of Athenian society that puts a different light in it. We have to, and it gets worse in some ways. I admit that what I'm going to talk about next stems from our own sort of, modern Western values and traditions. We need to avoid value judgments and the like when we look at ancient societies. But sometimes, sometimes it's impossible to not make these sorts of judgments. To begin with, there is the obvious inconsistency between the Athenians calling their political system a democracy, yet they did not allow women to vote or even to represent themselves in court. They segregated women in their societies. They weren't secluded in the kind of strictest sort of Taliban fashion, but nevertheless, women were kept in a different part of the house and they didn't get out that much. Although women were citizens, they couldn't vote, and they could be locked up in their bedrooms at night, and they had to be represented by their nearest male relatives in court. They also couldn't own land except in places like Sparta and Crete. Clearly then the Athenian women had less rights than in other ancient societies, such as Rome, actually. If you're interested in learning about Roman history, by the way, this summer, as I do every summer, I'll be teaching my class in Understanding Historical Change for Ancient Rome. It wasn't just the Athenians that conducted slavery, I'm moving on to that topic, but all the Greeks did. Greece was a slave-based economy, and in democratic polis, not just Athens, slave labor allowed the male citizens the leisure time to take part in political life. Slave labor also generated the revenue for state pay that allowed citizens to perform various paid political duties like going on embassies or attending an assembly, or even being a member of a jury. Probably we might give up on trying to understand the mores of Greek society, and ours is when it comes to children. I've already mentioned that in Athens, girls as young as 12 or 13 were getting married. Presumably, they could become pregnant as early as the next year. Never mind the relationship they had with their husbands, how successfully could they have coped with pregnancy and childbirth at that age? We hear that the Spartans were different in believing their females should be in their late teens when they got married because they could handle pregnancy and childbirth more successfully. To me, this implies the high mortality rates of elsewhere. Now, as I've said, the unsavory aspects of Athenian society admittedly stem from the values we have based on our own Western upbringing, our own morality. But they need to be said, especially as they've often been glossed over. We would be doing ourselves a disservice in wanting to know about the past if we edited out things that we find impalatable or that run counter to an image we want to have. Beneath the literary or artistic achievements of the Greeks as a whole, there was a darker side to the reality to their society, a reality that raises the question whether their achievements outweigh the downsides. And we've discussed now how family life then is different to an extent and how society's expectations of families also differed. The belief that the Oikos is the building block of the Polis is not as widely held today. No one, I think, would, well, as the example with divorce, I think would imply that how our society has come to a different sort of, in general, a kind of different view than that. And in terms of other aspects, we can see that there are lots of differences there as well. But what I'd like to do now, and maybe this actually will be a good time for us to kind of turn to maybe take a little break, and we'll come back. Is that what I know? Now that we've looked into the familial side of things, we've looked in sort of the microscopic version of the state in the oikos. Now I want to take a look at the polis as a macrocosm version of the oikos. And the oikos goes a long way in explaining how and why the Greeks lived their lives as they did, and how it shaped the development of the law code. And that's what I want to return to after our break. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to, first of all, stop the recording. I can pause it. So having discussed the aspects of Athenian society, we are now going to turn to law, because law is intimately connected with society. And since law is one of our course's major themes, it is to that we now turn. Now, it is in the 4th century BC that the legal system of Athens really reaches its maturity. Just as, in the 5th century, it was during that time that democracy and imperialism kind of reached their zenith in Athens, but it is in the 4th century that Athenian society really reaches a mature point in its legal system. And so we're going to discuss law in some detail tonight, and also in the future as well. And right now I will comment on the differences between the classical legal system and that of today. And then I want to look briefly at the relationship of Athenian law to society and vice versa. And I will do this with reference to 3 literary works, Aristophanes' Wasps, Plato's Crito, and Sophocles' Antigone, many of which, some of which, or if not all of which, you might have already read. Now, I've chosen these 3 because I believe these works show us in different ways and over a period of time how the Athenians were thinking about the development of their legal system and what their responsibilities were to it and what they thought they could expect from the laws. Of course, there are many more than 3 works from ancient Greece that we could have discussed here, but simply because of time and the confines of our course, I've chosen just these 3. But they do come from a wide variety of genres as well: comedy, tragedy, and a philosophical dialogue. So I think they're representative of the source material, as representative as we'll get. And they do show us how the Athenians viewed their legal system. Well, it is an understatement to say that the Athenian judicial system was different than that of ours today. For one thing, there was no separate class of professional lawyers or public prosecutors. Both prosecution and defense were drawn from ordinary citizens who would have to bring a case themselves and to speak on behalf of themselves in the courts before a jury of their peers. There was no cross-examination during a case, and while the testimony of witnesses was admissible, it was commonly written out, or at least after around 380, it was written before trial and then read out in court, thus relieving the ordinary citizen of the pressure of cross-examination. There was no single judge in control of things, a judge who might interpret points of law and guide the jury as ours do in our system today. The jurors were both judge and jury. That is why if you study Greek, and you will always see this point being made in the translations or in the commentaries, that dikastes is the word there. It means both judge and jury member because they were the same entities. These people interpreted the laws themselves. They even decided the penalty as well, because many of the crimes a defendant found, for many of the crimes, if a defendant was found guilty, he could propose an alternative penalty. The jurors did not seem to have been worried about precedent in any way, and as there was nothing like a higher court of appeal as there is today, once the jury had made its decision, that decision was final. Every year, a panel of 6,000 Athenian male citizens over the age of 30 was selected for jury service. The jurors were known as dikastai, or dicasts is the anglicized way to say that, and they swore an oath to uphold the laws, an oath that I'll actually read for you in a moment. They turned up on the days when the courts were in session, and this was every day of the year, apart from days when a festival was being held, when an assembly was meeting, or on days of ill omen. The Greeks had a strong belief in the idea that some days were unlucky, and therefore no official business could be held on those days. A complicated selection procedure was followed to reduce the possibility of bribery, as the men, the jurors, were randomly assigned courts to hear, different courts to hear different cases. They had no idea in advance what cases would come before them. I'll take you through later on the system from initiating a case to the court appearance and the method of jurors which they use to vote. And in so doing, I'll expand on some of the points that I'm going to be making right now. Another major difference between then and now was the speed of the trials. The Athenian Constitution tells us that 4 private cases and 1 public case were judged every day. So that means that the whole procedure was probably very rushed. The vote for or against the defendant was part of the trial day. And if a defendant was found guilty, his punishment was applied immediately. This included executions, which were carried out on the next day. So there was nothing like a death row in Athens. We have no idea, in fact, where the jail was inside of Athens, or whether it was just one building or a series of buildings. Some sources seem to indicate that the jail was in the general area of the Agora, as passers-by could see some of the prisoners. But on the other hand, if you go to Athens today and you walk down a wooden track a few minutes from the Pnyx area, the Pnyx was where the assembly met, you'll come across a cave in front of which there's a sign claiming this was the place where Socrates was imprisoned in 399 before execution. We just actually don't know whether that was the prison or not. So anyone who says he or she knows where the jail was in Athens is, is mistaken. Depending on the type of case, the jury was often composed of hundreds, and in some cases thousands of citizens. Think about the trial of the Argonauci generals, for example, in 406, where the entire assembly heard the case, several thousand men there. In the case of private suits, that is those that involved a sum of less than 1,000 drachmas, they had a jury of 201, the odd number, of course, chosen so as to avoid a split jury. Those suits over 1,000 drachmas had a 401 jury. In public suits, you could get juries of anything from 501 to 1,501. The speaking time for each side, prosecution and defense, was equal. It was measured by something called a clepsydra, or a water clock. And this water clock was only stopped for the quoting of evidence. For evidence and also witness testimony and things like that in private suits. The water clock was not stopped at all in public suits, which meant that you had to time things very carefully when it came to supporting evidence and the like. The way that it worked was that you would take a big bucket, basically, or a big, the clepsydra, and it would pour kind of like an hourglass, but it used water instead of sand, and it would drip into another basin, basically. But that amount of time that it took for the water to drip would be a set period of time, like an hour or something, and then that whole thing could be repeated. Now, we've already talked about the segregation of women in society, and that segregation carried over into the legal arena as well. Women were not allowed to appear in court, just as they couldn't attend the assembly. If a suit involved someone's wife, then the kurios, that is the head of the oikos, the husband usually, or if it was the daughter, the father, would come appearing on the woman's behalf. If it was a wife and her husband was deceased, or for some other reason she couldn't represent herself, perhaps he was, the husband, couldn't represent her. Perhaps he was overseas or in war or something like that. Then her nearest male relative would be the one to represent her. We have a famous prosecution speech of the late 330s BC that involves a woman named Naira, who was the wife of a fairly prominent Athenian man named Stephanus. This is an instance clearly of an Athenian citizen marrying outside the citizenry, because Naira was non-Athenian. Since she was Stephanus's second wife, that might well be the reason why the two of them got married, and I'll come back to that point a couple of times later on. I'll just say a few words about it right now. Naira was a former child prostitute from Corinth who had had children by other men. It looks like 3 children or so. She was freed from her brothel, but ended up in some abusive relationships until she was rescued by Stephanus of Athens. He took her to Athens and eventually married her. In the present case, Apollodorus, another Athenian man, had charged Naira with passing off her illegitimate children as legitimate Athenians. As we talked about before the break, only legitimate Athenians could inherit the oikos, and only children born from both parents who were Athenians could be citizens. So what Naira was doing was quite illegal. And Stephanus, her husband, is also incriminated on the charge because apparently he knew what was going on. Naira was indicted under a procedure called a graphe xenias, which was a public offense. It was a public procedure like adultery. And although the charge was made by Apollodorus against her, it was Stephanus, her husband, who delivered the defense speech. So, in other words, she could not defend herself in court. She had to get her kurios to do that for her. And the charge is political. We only have the prosecution speech from this trial. That's the speech by Apollodorus, and he makes it plain at the very beginning that he is the political enemy of Stephanus, that he has clashed with him a number of times politically, and that this is what's really going on when he brings this charge against Naira. What is more, the events of the case happened decades prior to this. Naira and Stephanus had been living together for probably 30 years, and no one had bothered them until now. A very nice example, I think, of a case that's brought for purely political reasons. But it also gives us a vivid insight into what the Athenians thought about trying to pass off illegitimate children as legitimate. For by extension, it gives us an insight into the importance attached to the oikos and the polis because of people's reaction to what Naira allegedly did. Women, as I keep on stressing, were marginalized by the law. And as I said, Naira was actually represented by her husband. She couldn't appear in court in her own person. Nonetheless, we have come a long way in some ways from the days of pre-Solonian Athens, when the non-nobles, remember, had no political, social, or judicial rights, when justice was dispensed arbitrarily and the ordinary people were at the mercy of the aristocratic families, both in their local areas and in Athens. Thanks now to state pay, the poor had the means to partake actively in political and judicial life, and they swore to uphold the laws in order to ensure stability in Athenian society and to ensure their own protection. Non-citizens, unsurprisingly, were not as well served by the laws. Metics, that is, resident aliens, had some judicial rights, and it was the Polemarchus Archon that was the magistrate charged with overseeing their disputes. The nothoi, or illegitimate children, had little judicial rights, and slaves, of course, had none. Today, by contrast, in our own law courts, there is a conscious attempt to protect everyone under the laws, even people who have entered a country illegally. But that was not the case in classical Greece at all. Back in Athens, of course, I should just say that almost all of our information about the law comes from Athens. The Athenians viewed this, they had this one special, almost magical term that they coined that was so important for them in terms of their legal outlook, called isonomia, or equality before the law. This was fundamental to their society. And isonomia, equality before the law, carried over into their political system as well, emphasizing the theoretical equality of everyone who lived in Athens. Like religion, law went hand in hand with Greek society. However, the Athenians had no such things as the rights of individuals as we do today. This is a big topic, but in general, the very idea of the individual is a kind of Enlightenment myth. The idea that we're somehow all, individuals, deracinated, cut off from everyone else, is absurd, and it is a concept that is distinctly modern. Just as the most prevalent malaise of modernism is the concept, is the problem of alienation. Right? We are also cut off from our roots, from our histories, from our all the things that have always traditionally given human beings their place in the world and their meaning, their identity. Now we live in an age where everybody has to construct their own identity out of their own fancies, out of their whatever thoughts please them for a time. This is, of course, not the case at all in any point in human history, definitely not in ancient Greece. So there was no such thing as individual rights, rights of the individual as we have them today. Before the break, we talked about the intimate relationship of the Oikos with the Polis, a far closer relationship than exists today. And this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, that we tend to view all of our rights as kind of only being existing for the individual. But in ancient Greece, it was really all about how does this, how does an infraction against the law affect the entire community? The Oikos helped the polis maintain its standard of living and therefore gave security to the whole state. Since the Oikos was the backbone of the polis, we see the Athenians develop their laws to protect the Oikos, and then the individuals who composed it only are kind of within that framework. And this is completely the opposite of what we have nowadays. The Athenian democracy is often called the rule of law by modern historians, and that is because of the isonomia at the heart of the society, which by extension bound the individual and the state together in a form of social contract. That's something that we today can identify with. Without that contract, society would fall into anarchy, the very last things that the Athenians wanted, and we know that by now. We can see something of the Athenian attitude to their developing legal code and the relationship of law to society in a number of contemporary literary works, and that is now, it is to those that I would like to turn for the rest of this portion of the lecture. This idea of the social contract is found in its most explicit form in classical Athens in Plato's dialogue, the Crito. In 399 BC, Socrates was condemned by a court on trumped-up charges of corrupting the youth and impiety. Apparently, he disbelieved in the traditional gods and tried to introduce new ones. That's what the charge said. He, of course, denied that. And he was sowing all sorts of wacky ideas in the minds of the youth, getting them to question everything. Socrates was therefore put on trial, found guilty, and condemned to death. And that would have been the next day, typically. However, because a certain ship had set sail to go and perform some religious rites and thereby initiated a period of time that the kind of like a prolonged religious celebration, and the ship wouldn't come back for about a month. That meant that Socrates had a long time to sit in prison and, of course, talk with his friends about philosophy. And on one occasion, his friend Crito visited Socrates. This would be actually on the eve of his execution because the boat had come back by this point. And in the dialogue, he tries to persuade Socrates to flee prison because his trial was a sham. The charges brought against him were for personal and political reasons and were not just. In reply, Socrates says that he, of course, is aware of all of this. He knows what's going on. But Socrates nevertheless refuses to flee because he has sworn to live by the laws of Athens and the decisions of the laws of the courts. In other words, although Socrates has been wrongly condemned, for Socrates to flee would mean dereliction of his duty and loyalty as a citizen, because Socrates says that it is not the laws that are at fault, but the citizens who put them into practice. Nevertheless, he's been found guilty, and now he has to suffer what the law lays down. The bottom line is that Athenian society, like any society that doesn't want to suffer anarchy, must uphold its own laws. The laws exist for the common good, and therefore individuals are bound to obey them so that they and the city can expect to be protected by them. Therefore, Socrates is willing to die. What is interesting, though, is that in 399 BC, when this takes place, Socrates agrees to die according to these man-made laws. Half a century, though, or so before Socrates' trial, the Athenians were grappling with the difference between natural or divine law and man-made law. And we can see this in all of the Greek tragedies, basically. All of the tragedies of the 5th century have at their heart the relationship between the Oikos and the Polis, okay, the family and the state. And if you've read any Greek tragedies, literally anyone, whether it's Oedipus the king, whether it's the Oresteia of Aeschylus, they all have this in them to some degree. Maybe not, okay, I can't say all, but many, many, many of them do. And certainly we can see this in one of the most famous of the Greek tragedies, Sophocles' Antigone, which was performed in about the year 441 BC. This was 4 years or so before the 30 Years' Peace that ended the First Peloponnesian War, remember. The First Peloponnesian War stretches from 460 to 445. Many of you have probably read the Antigone in high school or in college. In the Antigone, the king Creon has ordered that the corpse of one of Antigone's brother, Polynices, whom he considers a traitor, should not be buried, but be left to be eaten by birds and dogs. Creon, this of course is the worst possible thing that could happen for a Greek not to be buried, because then their soul never goes to the underworld. Creon has laid down the law and decreed that if anyone does bury him, that the person will be executed. Antigone also has lost her other brother, Eteocles, but he was a hero, and so he has been buried in accordance with what the society would expect, and that is full state honors. The play then is about the clash between natural or divine law on the one side and man-made law on the other. It binds together two things that are at the heart of Greek society, religion and law. Natural law says bury the dead. Not to do so is to dishonor the gods and also the deceased, because the souls of those who were not buried roam forever, never able to get into Hades. However, man-made law, in this case Creon's, says not to bury the man, Polynices, in this instance. Antigone then is in a dilemma as to which law to obey. Finally, she buries her brother Polynices, and when her execution is ordered, she kills herself by blocking herself up in a cave. And, that is the punishment that Creon inflicts on her. She then hangs herself inside of the cave. Creon hears what happened. He realizes the error of his ways, and he rushes to spare her. But when he arrives, she's already dead. There's also a nice kind of romance aspect to it, because Antigone was engaged to Creon's son, Haemon. And once Haemon learns about this, he kills himself. And then Creon's wife, Haemon's mother, sees him dead and kills herself. So Creon loses everything, basically, by thinking that he's being right. But he winds up being dead wrong. Now, whether there were tragedies or comedies, Plays were performed in ancient Greece to be put on at festivals, and they were written to win the first prize. They would be evaluated by a panel of judges who would, of course, take into account how they appeal to the people. And that means that playwrights were not going to write something that the people would hate, or something that went too far beyond what people at the time were thinking. Otherwise, the people wouldn't like the play and it would never win first prize. It's clear then that as Athenian society was changing and advancing, the people as a whole were wondering not only about a citizen's duty to the state and what would be the best laws to protect the state, but also about how to reconcile new laws with traditional ones. The Antigone captures all of that. Antigone followed natural law, but half a century later, Socrates followed man-made law. And perhaps the reason for this change in attitude was the intervening Peloponnesian War, which brought with it a falling away from traditional orthodoxy. The people clearly appreciated how serious law was, and by extension, how it was the anchor of their society. That the well-being of Athens rested on its laws, as well as its oikoi, is found in forensic oratory, for example, all the time. But that didn't mean that the Athenians couldn't enjoy a joke or two at the law's expense. And that actually brings me to the last literary piece I want to talk about right now. In 422, Aristophanes used the jury system as the plot for his satirical play, The Wasps. This was the year, 422, you remember, that in the Peloponnesian War, Cleon tried to recapture Amphipolis, but he and Brasidas the Spartan would both die in battle there. In this play, The Wasps, the chorus is made up of wasps, men who are dressed up like wasps, and they are jurors. They are characterized as old, cynical men who are always keen to find defendants guilty. And they are greedy, not only for their daily pay, which was 3 obols, about half of what an unskilled laborer would make, but just kind of greedy in general. But, you know, they are kind of portrayed as old, nasty men, really. In The Wasp, the anti-hero is an elderly juror who suffers from what Aristophanes calls jury mania, a made-up word that Aristophanes, he's fond of making up words. Aristophanes does this all to show that this elderly juror is not interested in the fairness of the case. He's only interested in being a juror so he can find the defendant guilty. He finds the enjoyment of entertainment and the value of entertainment at the courts, of watching the defendants squirm when attacked by their prosecutors. His son, the hero, is determined to cure his father of jury mania, and so he tries to keep his father prisoner at home, kind of like putting him in like a nursing home today or something like that. Eventually he succeeds, and it's quite a battle, but he does succeed. And along the way, he has to combat his father's various escape attempts and even hold a mock trial of the family dog that is accused of stealing cheese. It's a very funny play. You should read it. But is it funny because the picture Aristophanes paints of the jurors is wrong so that we laugh, or is the picture right? And that's the joke. If it's the latter, are we privileged to get an insight into the court system that shows us it was essentially amateur hour, despite how formalized the judicial system became? For a play to be successful, whether a comedy, satire, or tragedy, it would have to have a kernel of truth in it. And the same is true of today, right? The skits that work the best on a show like Saturday Night Live only work when they have a factual basis. But of course, unfortunately nowadays, everything is so sanctimonious and pious, dripping with, you know, this kind of self-righteousness that it's just not funny at all. But when political humor is funny, it does have to have this kind of kernel of truth in it. And so I'd like to suggest that while the court system did entertain, the image of the jurors in Wasps is not typical. I'd further argue that our factual base is only the old men who comprise the jurors. And that's because this play was performed in the early stages of the Peloponnesian War, which meant that all the younger men were away fighting. 422, remember the Battle of Amphipolis. So that left only the older men behind in the city to serve as jurors that year. There's no reason to think, I believe, that the nature of the jurors portrayed in the Wasps is typical, or that the jurors couldn't understand at least some of the points of law. Men of the 4th century BC were fairly knowledgeable about current and past events, many from attending the assembly or even serving in the boule. and those who served as jurors would have also attended assembly meetings at least. I think then men of the 4th century BC were more knowledgeable about affairs than men of the 5th century. And of course, there was always the street talk that permeated Athens when the city faced an event of significant import. Men collected in the agora and in places like barbershops or, cafes to discuss current events. They might not know all the ins and outs of them, but they had some idea of things as a result of all of this. And what we see also in the forensic speeches of the 4th century is that they were filled with political content, especially if the case involved a public matter. The courts were often as political an arena as the assembly itself, and those giving speeches in court were often as versed in rhetoric as speakers in the assembly. They had to be, because just as in the assembly, speakers in court needed to put on a good performance to help their case appeal to the jury. But speakers in court also paid due regard to law and to the jurors' knowledge of it. Appeals, for example, might be rhetorical, as we'll discuss later, but there was no place for rhetoric in what law entailed. In other words, what made up the law. The law was the law. Lex dura sed lex, as the medieval formulation goes. The law is harsh, but it is the law. The jurors also swore a lengthy dicastic oath, which is given to us in a speech by Demosthenes. And I would like to quote the entirety. Well, I won't quote the entirety because it's just too long. I'm going to quote now the relevant clauses from it. Okay, so this is what any person who became a juror would have had to swear. Quote, if any man tries to subvert the Athenian democracy or makes any speech or any proposal in contravention thereof, I will not comply. I will not allow private debts to be cancelled, nor lands, nor houses belonging to Athenian citizens to be redistributed. I will not restore exiles or persons under sentence of death. I will not expel nor suffer another to expel persons here resident in contravention of the statutes and decrees of the Athenian people or of the council. I will not take bribes in respect of my judicial action, nor shall any other man or woman accept bribes from me with my knowledge by any subterfuge or trick whatsoever. I will give impartial hearing to prosecutor and defendant alike, and I will give my verdict strictly on the charge named in the prosecution. End quote. The juror would have sworn all this by the gods Zeus, Poseidon, Demeter, and in doing so, the jurors invoke destruction upon themselves and their households if they transgress this oath. That is not a small thing for a pagan of the 5th or 4th century to do. Given the importance of religion in Greek life and the fact that the oath was sworn in the names of these principal gods of the upper and lower worlds, this oath was not only serious and not made lightly, but was taken really seriously. These gods could overrule Athens's patron deity Athena herself if they wanted to punish the city. That is, if jurors sacrilegiously broke their oaths. Okay, so we have to take that quite seriously. Of course, perjury, which means taking an oath in court and then lying, is still a serious crime to this day. But to get the kind of religious scruples, kind of to be able to appreciate that, if you're familiar with the play or the movie A Man for All Seasons, the story of Sir Thomas More, that kind of gets a little bit more at it. He refused to perjure himself and therefore was ultimately condemned to death by Henry VIII. Something like that. Anyway, the juror swore this oath, and we might ask ourselves, who served as a juror? Jury pay was not a fortune. Pericles, as I mentioned before, had introduced in the 450s about 2 obols a day, and in the 420s, this was raised by Cleon to 3 obols a day, about the equivalent of a half drachma. An unskilled laborer at this time made 1 drachma a day, so it's about half the rate of pay of an unskilled laborer. What is more, the daily payment stayed at the 3 obol level even as late as the end of the 4th century, even though pay for attending the assembly, as well as basic wages, rose considerably. A normal attic worker could make far more on a building project or in the fields at harvest time than a juror could. And I'll have a few words to say on the difference between those two at a later time. But a good number of jurors were probably those who could afford to take time off of work. That's kind of where I'm going with all this. And the elderly, of course, who didn't work anymore. And they saw jury pay as a bit like a way to supplement their income. It didn't represent a broad cross-section of society like it does today. Nevertheless, jurors took their participation in the jury system seriously, and they understood that this rule of the law was the basis of Athenian society. In swearing to uphold the laws, they strove to ensure that their society lived by them, that the well-being of the polis was anchored in them, and thus that the polis did not suffer anarchy or oligarchy, the one form of government that the Athenians were most against. Think about the reaction of the men from the fleet, with the fleet at Samos in 411 during the rule of the 400 in Athens, and especially think about the reaction of the Athenians to the bloody oligarchy of the 30 in 404 to 403 BC. But having kind of said all of that, I now want to turn to our final portion for tonight's lecture, kind of give a historical survey of the development of the judicial system. And this will involve a little recap, but that's necessary from time to time. And I want to bring together various threads that we've been weaving about this whole time tonight, about the law's origins and early developments. And then with these fresh in our minds, we can then go on to see how law reaches its mature form and what are its characteristics. Okay, so again, if you're following along with the notes, this would, I believe, be on page 7, the historical development of the legal code. Basically, when you look at the historical development of the legal code from the kind of Wild West period, when it first began back at the end of the late Bronze Age, to the maturity of the judicial system in the classical period, it's an amazing achievement. Okay, it's an amazing achievement because law is one of those fundamental things to society. I want to kind of recap some of this because we've learned a lot about this from earlier lectures, and I just want to kind of bring it back to be fresh in our minds. And that is needed so that we can kind of appreciate just how much of an achievement was by the time the maturity of the law code arrives in the 4th century. Dracon, for example, we learned about him in a long time ago. He's probably not as fresh in our minds anymore. So, and of course, before Dracon, there was law in Greece, although it was more of the informal, as I said, frontier type of justice, an eye for an eye style, something similar to the severe law code established by the Babylonian king Hammurabi, who ruled from 1792 BC to 1750. Although the Greeks would have not been very conversant with his legal code, we do know from the poems of Homer that disputes between individuals over property or land could be settled by negotiation. But more often than not, they were settled by an actual fight, fisticuffs. And some lines from Homer's Odyssey, tell us what people expected and how they expected to fight one another when cattle or sheep were involved. I'll just quote a couple of lines right here. Quote, "A man's heart knows no sorrow or anguish when he is hit during fighting for his own possessions, either for cattle or for white sheep," end quote. Cattle and sheep, of course, were prized possessions, and they were vital for economic survival in this period. In fact, a nice little linguistic insight into this is that the word in Latin for money, pecunia, is directly related to the word for flock, pecos. Okay, if you've ever had pecorino romano cheese, it means kind of sheep cheese, or cheese made from sheep milk. But the same word for flock, pecos, and money, pecunia. And why is that? Because obviously, in ancient societies, money, before there was coins, there was flocks of sheep and cattle and things like that. Those were the prized possessions, and they were vital for economic survival in the archaic periods, or even, in the Bronze Age, so on too. So was land, and therefore we can understand the need to protect land at all times. And we can draw an analogy with the importance attached to cattle even in the American Wild West, and the quickness of ranch owners to deal with cattle rustlers, usually by hanging them. At least that's what they do in the movies. But I think that's true. I think that even when law did arrive in the American West, hanging was still the prescribed punishment for cattle rustlers and horse thieves. Homer tells us that an individual's family got involved in disputes and that this was also expected. This type of family intervention could turn into the blood feuds that lasted for generations. For example, if a father was killed in a fight, it was expected that his son would take over and go after the killer. If a brother got killed, then the man's father or brother would go after the killer, and so on and so forth. And relatives, male relatives, were expected to get involved in disputes even in the early stages of them. And what comes out of all this and helps to shape the legal code is the importance attached to the family unit, the Oikos. And that importance extends throughout Greek history. If you ever read the Oresteia of Aeschylus, which is basically the mythological origins of the law courts of Athens, Aeschylus puts it in the myth of the family of Atreus, the house of Atreus, the Oikos of Atreus, where every generation basically is locked into this net of blood feuds, and that is only broken at the very end by the divine institution by Athena of the first trial by jury for murder. Okay, that where the state takes over the prerogatives of justice and not the individual family members. In these early years, though, in the kind of uncivilized time of, the Bronze Age or the Archaic period, disputes would stretch over generations, and usually at some point families would come to some agreement. For instance, a victim's family might accept a payment from the other family. Justice, though, as we can see, was mostly dispensed on the spot. Getting a third party to intervene as an arbitrator rarely happened, except when both parties could agree on something, and perhaps when both parties had fought themselves to a standstill. When it did, this would either be a tribal elder, or more usually in the Bronze Age, it would be the king of the palace center. The king would settle disputes by virtue of his royal authority, and his word was law. From Homer, we learn that disputes were heard in public, with the people gathered around the agora, the market area. And this was probably the only area where a large crowd could assemble. In the passage of Homer's Iliad known as the Shield of Achilles, which I believe is in book 19 of the Iliad, we see described a scene involving two disputants. A number of elders are judging the case. The people are looking on and cheering from both sides, and heralds are trying to keep them quiet. This is, of course, a scene from a poem, possibly embellished for literary effect, and we don't know how common the judicial process outlined here actually was throughout Greece, but presumably it was based on how things were actually conducted. And it is important to note the influence of public opinion on speakers and judges. This is a point we will return to later next week, actually. From all of this, though, we can see how arbitrary and problematic law was in the pre-Archaic period, in the Bronze Age. For example, a king's or a tribal elder's ruling might not necessarily be the best or fairest. The king, after all, was a just man. He had many things to do on his plate, so presumably he could not assess or settle all disputes with any expertise or in any fairness. Moreover, how fairly did a fight settle a private dispute? The victim might not be as good of a fighter as the criminal, and so the victim would not only lose the fight, but he would lose the case. Well, finally, the presence of public spectators who seemed to get involved in the case, shouting and jeering as they both heard sides of the dispute, this had to have had a negative effect on the speakers, and especially on the elders or the king as they gave their verdicts. Nowadays, of course, there is silence in the courtroom, but not back then. It wasn't until the late Archaic period, when we start to have more historical information, that we know the Greeks began to form a formal legal code. As we know, during the Dark Ages, that is the period from roughly the end of the Bronze Age, around 1150 BC to the start of the Archaic period, say 750 BC, the palace center was replaced by a polis that came to be the chief city of a particular area. Think of Athens and Attica. The monarchy disappeared at the end of the Bronze Age, and its power was replaced by that of the aristocratic families called eupatridae. These eupatridae dispensed justice as arbitrarily as the kings and elders before them had done, and there was no right of appeal in this period either. It's also in this period, as the Dark Ages start to come to an end and the Archaic period begins, that starving non-noble farmers called hectemeroi, the sixth sharers, those who had pledged up to 1/6 of their annual produce as a sort of interest payment in return for help, is when they started to run into even more severe problems than trying to eke out an existence for themselves and their families. These severe problems were simply the fact that when the hectemeroi could not pay their debts, their farms were seized and they and their families could be sold into slavery. This is a scenario for civil war, and it did come. As we know, it broke out. In other polis, similar grievances had led to aristocratic rulers being expelled by popular rulers called tyrants. There may have been an attempted tyranny in Athens when Cylon briefly seized the Acropolis in the 630s, perhaps 632. Given his abortive coup, and in an attempt to prevent possible civil war in Attica, as it happened elsewhere, the eupatridae chose Dracon to codify the laws. We covered Dracon a long time ago, but as I said, it is important to recap so that we have everything fresh in our minds. Dracon, as we know, didn't stop the civil distress, the civil war, and perhaps given what he did, the Civil War continued. The fact that the Civil War continued is not a surprise, because Dracon made everything so, the punishment for everything he made death. So it was so draconian that it's not a surprise that Civil War continued. But nevertheless, Dracon did begin the process that would lead to a formal legal code. We don't know exactly how he did it or what he actually did. Administration and justice was still in the hands of the aristocrats, but Dracon does seem to have taken some of the arbitrary nature of the dispensation of justice and the punishment for a crime away from the eupatridae. According to our sources, it seems that he made the penalty, as I said, for almost every crime death, and that is why his name gives us the word draconian. More importantly for us right now, though, Dracon took away from the traditional right of the family to seek vengeance when wronged, and he put this right to seek justice in the hands of the state. And that is a major turning point, okay? It is the fact that that does not happen in so many other parts of the world that still has allowed those places to continue in blood feuds that compel each new generation to spill more blood and thus perpetuating the whole problem. Okay, think of the Palestinian Israeli conflict, think of Northern Ireland, you could probably think of many other places as well. Okay, Dracon's legislation then was a significant advancement in the legal rights of the people, because before his time, the aristocrats were the ones who dispensed justice, and they also decided the penalties for various crimes. Dracon modified the system by taking the personal element out of the law as far as punishment was concerned, and replacing it with an objective standard that everyone knew, so that everyone knew what to expect. This was the start of the development of the law code proper. The people, though, were not appeased, and by the year 600, the plight of the peasants in the countryside was worse. Moreover, we probably had on the scene by now this new class of citizens, the middle stratum of society, the hoplites, that were now faced with, they were not faced with economic ruin, but they were still discontented. Their discontent having to do with their lack of political rights. And so civil war broke out again. It lasted a good number of years before the eupatridae elected Solon as extraordinary archon in 594 to end the warfare. And we know that Solon was unsuccessful ultimately in ending the civil strife, but he did introduce a series of wide-sweeping political, economic, and judicial measures that would transform Athens and its people. As far as his judicial legislation went, and that's what we're concerned with here, Solon amended many of Dracon's laws, and he introduced the right of appeal, a procedure called ephesis, against a magistrate's decision. This presumably went in tandem with the court Solon set up called the Heliaia. He also introduced third-party arbitration, In other words, he made it possible for any citizen to prosecute on behalf of another, where previously only the injured party had the right to initiate proceedings. Solon also introduced a number of laws that affected women and the family, the Oikos. For example, he laid down rules about what women should wear in public, laws about inheritance matters, speaking ill of the dead, and a law that children had to look after their parents in old age, since there was no social security in Athens. The Heliaia, that is the Court of Appeals, was a tremendous leap forward, and I would make so bold as to say that it was the ancestor of the People's Court, of the fully developed Athenian democracy. The Athenian Constitution actually says the right of appeal was one of Solon's most significant reforms. The court is controversial, the Heliaia, and some scholars think that the word simply means assembly and that no actual court was meant. However, it is generally accepted that Solon's introduction of the right of appeal can be linked to an appeal court. What did this appeal court do? The two generally accepted functions are that it examined a case afresh, or it decided whether the prescribed penalty could be exceeded. Whichever of these two is right, and I happen to think the first one, that it considered a case afresh, the beauty of the Heliaia was that it gave non-nobles a much greater say in the dispensation of justice, which for so long had been the preserve of the nobles. Dracon may have begun the road that led to the development of a formalized legal code, but Solon was equally instrumental in the development of the judicial system. What is more, as the Athenian Constitution tells us, the people swore to uphold and live by the laws, and current and new laws were set up in the public, in the agora, the marketplace, for all to see. They were not kept hidden away and referred to only by word of mouth or in hushed tones. Everyone now could see the laws. That gave rise, towards the end of the 5th century, to a central record office or state archives being established, a place called the Metron. A precise date isn't known for that, but it's somewhere between 403 and 399. The Metron was located in the Agora, and it was a major improvement in the city's administration because in it were kept copies of laws, decrees, treaties, and anything that was a public record written down and made available at all times for the public to consult. Connected to the Metron and the Boule, for that matter, was the cult of the Mother of the Gods. That is why it was called the Metron. So from Meter and then On is like the place of the Meter. Metron. Mother of the Gods was the protector of the laws, they thought. So the Athenians then, in swearing to uphold the laws, were also swearing by the Mother of the Gods. The laws took on this religious significance, is the point to take away. The problem with Solon's laws is that many were introduced at a later period and backwards ascribed to him to give them a sort of pedigree. If it's a law by Solon, it must be good. And that is why in 410, a group of officials were elected called anagraphes, the word simply means the inscribers, whose job was to collect all the laws of Solon and re-inscribe them on stone in a public space. This job was supposed to take 4 months, but in the following year, 409 BC, they were still hard at work on it. And this is probably because so many of the laws attributed to Solon were not his, and the anagraphes had to try to work out the genuine ones from the spurious ones. Their commission was extended to 409 BC to include the laws of Dracon on homicide. Well, it took Pisistratus, the tyrant of the 6th century, to address the plight of the non-nobles, as we know. Cleisthenes, the other father of democracy, ended civil strife properly, as we know, and although the next few decades were chaotic because of the Persian invasions and the return of influence, to influence of the Areopagus in political affairs, the new law code must have continued to develop. We know, for example, that Pisistratus introduced traveling deme judges, thus taking justice to the people. Also, Cleisthenes is credited with the judicial procedure known as ostracism. Moreover, an offshoot of Cleisthenes' political legislation was a subtle change in the nomenclature for law. Before Cleisthenes, the word used by the Greeks for law was thesmos, a word basically meaning something that had been laid down by a superior body or person, like a king, a decree, if you like. In the case of Athens, this would have probably been the Council of the Areopagus. Moreover, the thesmos was a law that the people might not agree with, but they had to accept. But following Cleisthenes' legislation, thesmos gave to the word nomos, and nomos remained the standard for law throughout the rest of the classical period, and indeed right on up till the present day in Greek, in the modern Greek language. Nomos is subtly different from thesmos in that nomos doesn't just mean law, but it also kind of means like custom or the accepted way of doing things. And therefore it has a more kind of representative of the people quality. It's more democratic, if you like, than thesmos, which has this narrower sense of a few being responsible for making law at the expense of the mass of people. Nomos is clearly a democratic word, and so therefore it has to be post-Cleisthenic. The most important figure in the development of the legal code after Solon was this fellow Ephialtes in 462, who, when he introduced his radical democratic legislation, the Athenian Constitution tells us that he transferred much of the judicial powers away from the Areopagus and gave them to the law courts. The Areopagus retained only a few rights. For example, the right to try cases of premeditated homicide, arson, deliberate wounding, attempting tyranny, damaging Athens' sacred olive trees. The Areopagus was a very important court. A sign of this is that in Aeschylus's Oresteia, which I've already referred to, this great trilogy that was performed in Athens in 458, the Areopagus is the court where Orestes, the son of Agamemnon, pleads his defense for killing his mother, Clytemnestra, and getting the Erinyes off of his back. When Agamemnon returned home from the Trojan War, he discovered that Clytemnestra had taken up residence with her lover Aegisthus. And when Agamemnon was taking a bath, Clytemnestra had him murdered. She actually took part in the murder herself. In revenge for this, Orestes killed his mother, and the Erinyes, the Furies, went after him and kind of tormented him drove him to the ends of the earth on Clytemnestra's behalf. Eventually, then, Orestes ends up in Athens to plead his case before the Areopagus, the first case they will ever hear. And Athena, in the end, recommends that Orestes be found innocent. So Athena actually kind of comes down from Olympus and gives the deciding vote. And what is important about this case, as Aeschylus gives it to us in the Oresteia of 458, is that it's the first real example we have, even though the trial itself is mythological and set in the Bronze Age. It is the first real example we have of the family revenge, that family's fight of vengeance, passing from family, oikos, to family, and then ultimately now being taken away from the personal members of the family and being put under the jurisdiction of the state. From vendetta to democracy, we can say the lex talionis, the law that says the wrongdoer must suffer, now is taken away and given over to be judged in a court case where we have trial by jury, rational debate, and evidence. And this is an important change. It shows us the importance of the Areopagus, and we also see that the change that Dracon instituted by taking the subjective element in dispensing law out of the family and giving it to the state is now fully up and running. Well, Ephialtes' legislation led to a vast increase of court business and court meetings. An appeal court like the Heliaia, comprised of the same people, just couldn't sit every day and hear every case. After all, if somebody was found guilty, the chances were that that person would appeal his sentence. So this court was going to get busier and busier. It was decided at some point to make a selection of people's representatives of the entire populace, in other words, a jury of one's peers. And this meant that by Ephialtes' time, the Athenians had invented trial by jury. I say this because the Athenian Constitution tells us that Ephialtes transferred the judicial powers of the Areopagus to the courts, plural. There had to be more than one, not just the Heliaia. And more than one court equals trial by jury. So out of the Heliaia, established by Solon, grew the right to trial by ordinary citizens, being judged by a jury of one's peers. And this is one of the great bastions of every democratic society. We take it for granted, but it was such a huge achievement of the Greeks. As I mentioned on a previous occasion, every year a panel of 6,000 citizens over the age of 30 was chosen to act as jurors. They swore an oath to judge according to the laws, that is, to uphold the laws properly and to judge fitly and without bias. You see, earlier, when I said that I would make so bold as to say that the Heliaia was the ancestor of the people's courts, of the developed democracy, well, here we are now. That is it. And there are other developments in the legal code, of course, such as a more formal arbitration system that I won't discuss right now. We're going to hold off on that till next week. Ephialtes also entrusted the judicial scrutiny of the magistrate's term of office, the Othune, to the assembly. And after the assembly conducted this scrutiny into how an archon had discharged his duties, if the assembly found that this archon had been corrupt or inept in any way, it could refer him to a law court where he would be put on trial. Well, sometime in the 5th century BC, the judicial procedure known as a graphe paranomon was introduced. And graphe paranomon basically means something like prosecution for proposing an illegal law. Basically, if someone proposed a new law in the assembly, and any citizen was entitled to do this, he was personally responsible for that law and for ensuring that it didn't contravene any existing ones. If someone challenged the proposal, then the law that had been put forward was put on hold while a court decided whether it was legal or not. If the person proposing it had some ulterior motive, then he could be liable to indictment under the procedure called a graphe paranomon. The same was true if the manner by which he had gotten the law enacted was procedurally flawed, because a person proposing a new law, even if it was accepted by the assembly, could be prosecuted, could be indicted under a graphe paranomon for up to 1 year after his law had been passed. If he was found guilty on the same charge of graphe paranomon 3 times, then the person lost his citizenship rights. He became what was known as an atimos, which means someone without honor. He lost his rights as a citizen, and he could no longer take part in political life. Well, this procedure of the graphe paranomon presumably grew out of the desire to ensure that no laws were introduced that might potentially harm the state or contravene existing ones. Exactly when the graphe paranomon was introduced is unknown, but the earliest attested reference to it is in 415 BC, the last decade or so of the Peloponnesian War. It soon became something of a political weapon that could be used against opponents, and because of its ostracism, ostracism fell into disuse. You see, it kind of took the place of ostracism. And that is, of course, because ostracism was only held once a year, whereas a graphe paranomon could be brought by a man against another at any time. I want to finish our lecture right now on an innovation that, for me, marks the coming of age of the legal system that Dracon had kicked off in the 620s. Many of Solon's laws as the classical period continued were getting outdated, which is why the anagrophes, as I mentioned earlier, the inscribers, were ordered to collect all the laws of Solon and reinscribe the original ones in stone. Their job would indicate by this time, 410, 409, that the Athenian law code was pretty much written in stone, established. However, something happened at the end of the 5th century BC that few could have predicted. And this was in the year this happens in the year 404. The Athenians lost the Peloponnesian War. They suffered a Spartan oligarchy until 403. And when democracy was restored in 403, the Athenians decided it was time for a clean slate. They decided to make up some major changes to their law code. And so they set up 2 new boards of nomothetai, literally those who lay down the law, lawgivers, we might say. And these 2 new boards of men, the nomothetai, were to examine which of the so-called laws of Solon and Dracon were relevant and which should be updated. And there's a big difference then between the anagrophes, who were simply there to say, okay, this is an original law. I think that that one's a spiritual one. And now the nomothetai, who were there to say, here's an original law, but is it still relevant? Does it need updating? And this updating of earlier laws was completed in the Archon year 403 to 402. Remember, the Athenian year went from August to August, so we have to say 403 to 402. This was during the archonship of Euclides. This Archon year was seen as the start of a new legal era for Athens. No law was valid until it had been included in this revision of the laws. So the nomothetai looked at every law, and no prosecution could ever be brought against someone for offenses before 403. So this revision of the laws was accompanied by a kind of general amnesty. The Athenians really wanted to wipe the slate clean. At the same time, a revolutionary change was taking place and was made as far as the decrees passed by the assembly or boule becoming law. Because before 403 BC, if the assembly accepted a proposal, it became law, a nomos, automatically. After 403, a committee of nomothetai met on an increasingly regular basis to decide whether the assembly should accept this formal policy as law. And thus the nomothetai became kind of like a supreme court, really, and or maybe even better, an interim stage for the enactment of nomoi. Nomoi, the plural of nomos. If the assembly voted for a new law, the nomothetai would decide whether it should be part of the formal law code. Now, that doesn't mean that if they decided against it, the validity of the law, that the person who proposed it was automatically subject to the graphe paranomon. Presumably, individual cases were decided on their merits or lack thereof, because a decision might be taken to proceed with a graphe paranomon against the person, but then again, it might not be. The powers given to the nomothetai can only be explained by the Athenians' wish to have uniformity in their laws after 403, and to keep that uniformity throughout the 4th century BC. But it is important to stress the role of the assembly, and thus of the Athenian citizens here. The nomothetai could not act independently. They themselves could not introduce new laws. This was still the preserve of the citizens in the ecclesia, the assembly. Nor could the nomothetai make changes to the existing laws after an investigation. They still had to report to the assembly, which had the final say. Okay, that is where I'm going to end it for today. In our next lecture, I want to talk about judicial machinery, the magistrates, the courts, and the arbitrators, and we'll see in the process that despite what we've said in the past about the role of the assembly in the city, the Athenians may have attached less importance to attending the assembly than in taking part in their legal system. And